Today's episode deals with a very sensitive subject of mental health and suicide. Viewer discretion and listener discretion is advised.
When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
What exists, reality itself, is gorgeous. It is the plenum, the fullness of total joy. The universe is a celebration. It's a fireworks show to celebrate that existence is. Wowee.
For those of us seeking a life of meaning and purpose, capturing fulfillment in every moment of now, seeking the truths of our reality so we can live this life to its fullest. This is the Live This Life podcast. And I'm your host, Heath Cummings. I'm here to inspire you to ask yourself the question every day. Are you living? Or are you killing time? Today, I want to share a very special and difficult and emotional story on a very difficult and emotional subject for millions of people in this world, and that is of mental health and suicide. In the spirit of October being Mental Health Awareness Month and November being Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, I want to talk about the very special subject of mental health and the impact of suicide from multiple angles. Particularly, I want to talk about the impact that suicide has left on my life through the many experiences that I've had throughout the years. Now, I'm not a big one for trigger warnings. Many of you who listen to the show pretty often are very well aware of that. My view is things are going to happen in life and the chips are going to fall where they may, and life doesn't come with trigger warnings. But given the sensitive nature of this subject and how graphic some of the stories are going to be, I'm not going to dive in too deep, but definitely deeper than I have before. I want to avoid putting people through any unnecessary hardships. So especially for this one, I definitely want to put the precursor out there that this episode may be a lot for some people to handle. So just want to get that out there in the beginning. I'll be talking about my experiences with suicide in probably one of the most unfiltered and graphic natures that I think I've ever told some of these stories in any media form before. I've talked about them in some pretty close circles with people, but I've never really dove in to some of these stories in media formats on shows that I've been on and everything because, I didn't want to focus on the nitty gritty when I'm invited on other people's shows. I felt like it was a lot for people to handle. And to be honest, I didn't want to burden people with the negative impact of how those stories can be kind of a downer and just painting those graphic images. Really didn't want to go down those roads. I was more focused on the events and how they shaped my life and my view on life and our existence rather than, the awful aspects of it all. But honestly, it's the truth of the matter. And although it's an inconvenient truth for a lot of people, their comfortable lives don't expose them to some of these things. I think understanding this from numerous different perspectives and hearing these stories sometimes helps people become a little bit more empathetic toward what people might be going through, because we heard a lot of very insensitive commentary along the road of trying to accomplish the project that we just accomplished recently that sparked this episode. And, I felt like sometimes diving too deep into some of the stuff that I wanted to really talk about would overshadow the over-encompassing message of what I really wanted to share in like an hour-long episode. But now, I've kind of shifted my mindset and I've been motivated to do this episode because I've been immersed in everything all over again. I've come face to face with some of the very difficult times of my past, particularly at that bridge that I had so much experience with. And I'll be talking about that today and the traumas that it did bring to my life and the place that it does fit into my life, like it or not, it's there. And I figured it was a great moment when we were kind of putting the bookend on this entire experience to go back into it and finally tell some of these stories that I've told in some very close circles, but really never on a scale this big with thousands of people listening and opening myself up there to the world. But in all reality, this podcast wouldn't exist if this portion of my life, kind of everything that motivated me to go down the road that I was going on, if this stuff didn't exist. So I figured it was a great time to put it to rest, because we were able to end an era for many of us in this region, and that was a good time to do it all. So yeah, there's several reasons why I wanted to dive into this. One, again, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and I think that given the places that I've come from and the things that I've gone through, and the contributions, no matter how small they might be, the contributions to the world of mental health and promoting it and trying to get people out there to realize that when there's something going wrong, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Everybody has their times. And when people have viewed me throughout all the years, I've always put on a shiny veneer of whatever I was going through. And some of my most difficult times, people couldn't detect that. And I think there's something to be said that when people look at somebody and they think they've got their stuff all together, they got their shit together and they're not falling apart at the seams, and find out after the fact they really were, it I guess humanizes the entire experience a little bit more and makes people kind of realize like, wow, this stuff really does happen to everybody. And it really does. No matter how much people might seem to think that they're, they put the public view on that they're strong and everything, people go through some serious stuff behind the scenes you have no idea about. And I think the big motivator behind all of this and talking about this today is to share that story, to share the difficulties that I did encounter throughout all those years and the story of survival. Because ultimately, I think everybody goes through a level of this, maybe not as bad, and sometimes it's way worse. But I think everybody goes through some major traumatic experiences in life. And through it all, we have to find some sort of purpose through that pain. And in my deepest moments, I had to try to find that meaning. And, I did. It took some time, but I eventually did. And it was a huge help to know that that pain was just temporary and that the sun would shine on my life again. And I think that message is a huge one for people who might feel like they've got nowhere to turn, and knowing that things will turn around. And that there's some people who never were fortunate enough to have that chance to wait for things to turn around. And I want to share their message as well, because even in their passing, even the fact that they're not here, their impact has still been made, and their loss wasn't in vain. Their stories have potentially saved many lives into the future with what we've been able to do since then. Secondly, again, I want to talk about the stigmas behind all of this as well. Mental health is, very stigmatic in the circles of public safety, and, certain male traits in some of those circles of public safety folks. There is no glory in being a tough guy. And that was one of the big things I wanted to get out there. People, I think, glorify being able to take on so much pain and not letting it show. I think for some reason or another, some of us, if we show that the armor has had some sort of a weakness in it, that we now feel like our entire persona has been damaged. And I'll tell you right now that there is no one who goes through some serious traumatic incidents that don't get scarred and damaged in some sort of way. Some of them deal with it just completely differently. And it's some of those indirect methods that do the most damage, whether it's alcohol or avoidance or drugs or whatever vices people can get their hands on. Those can be some of the most damaging attributes to trying to handle some of these stressors. Facing these things head on and dealing with them when they come up is extremely hard. And that's one of the other main messages I wanted to get out there. It's easier to run. Trust me, I get it. I, to a certain extent, ran from a lot of the different things that were tough for me. And one of the main lessons I've learned now is, you head right at it with a full head of steam and you go right at one of those things. And, you dedicate yourself to it, because the longer you string things out and you avoid it, the longer the pain tends to be. And sometimes you can do more damage. It takes an immense amount of strength and confidence to face it head on. And even if you don't get to that point, because this all happens in divine timing for all of us, it's something to strive for, is that trying to take the most direct route to deal with your pain is one of the things I think is going to help everybody in the long run get over these types of things that I'll talk about today. But knowing that there's support out there and there's people that are willing to listen and help, and there's people who want to listen and help, is the complete opposite sometimes of what we think when we're in those moments. That we don't want to burden people with our stories, and we don't want to, drag people down, and other people have things going on. It's like they would rather be there in your darkest moments in the middle of the night taking that phone call than having to attend your funeral. And I think it's a major message to get out there to everybody. But lastly, one major reason we're talking about this one today is that, again, we've had that recent victory over one of the biggest areas of trauma that I've personally gone through in my life, and one of the bigger focus areas in this region that I happen to live on in the fight against mental health, wellness, and suicide. So, speaking on all those points, I'm very glad to say that we're talking about this today because the era that we've been working on has kind of come to a close. And I had the privilege recently to celebrate with some of the people whom I'll talk about today and their amazing contributions that led to this victory. So because of them, thankfully, the era is now over, and there's a bit of closure and a bookend on this saga for all of us. But before we get started, I want to mention just a couple of things. I'm only doing one ad break in this episode for BetterHelp. In the spirit of mental health and wellness, they have been a huge catalyst for millions of people, and they are one of the many resources out there to help people when it's needed. But in cases of crisis, like I'll talk about today, someone who's at a place where they're contemplating ending their life, that requires a whole different angle from something like BetterHelp or counseling. Dialing 988 from any cell phone will get you to the National Crisis Hotline, where qualified and licensed specialists can get you immediate help that you need. Dialing 911 also is in an emergency services contact. And the people who are in those lines of work now are much better trained and empathetic toward anyone going through crisis situations, much more than maybe the stigmas of the past would let people to believe, that would make them afraid to reach out. But don't be afraid to reach out for help in either one of those places, because some of these fights you cannot fight alone. And this is one that you shouldn't fight alone if you're at that point. So you matter, and everybody who will be there to help you is going to tell you that you do matter, and you all deserve to be here tomorrow. So in taking stock of some of these rough times that I had back when I was a police officer for nearly 2 decades, and going through some of these tribulating moments, I learned a lot about myself and about how precious and fragile and really limited life is in all reality. I gained much of the strength and confidence that I have now by being more candid about those times than I was at certain points in my life. I thought that when I had let those moments affect me, when I let them in and they were sort of dragging me down, that it was a weakness, I guess. And I let that go. I let the effects of letting it weigh me down so much and making me feel any sort of way but a way that was approaching a healthy aspect of my life and trying to take care of something that needed to be taken care of. I let all that stuff go, and it was one of the major lessons that I learned in the course of this entire journey. And, it's been very therapeutic to get out there and talk about this on different podcasts and other places, and getting it all out there rather than bottling it all up was just something that I never guessed would be as helpful as it actually had been. And I think that's one of the major reasons why I started this podcast, and why I was very much fascinated in the stories of trauma to triumph very early on in this podcast. I know I've definitely shied away from it in recent years, because it was a lot for me to handle, to revisit a lot of those things, because I had to keep on diving into some of my own stuff. Which I guess kind of meant that there was a little bit more of that in the closet than maybe I was actually expecting. This whole experience just recently just kind of dragged all that out for me as well. This episode actually took me a few weeks to get it finalized and right, and starting to record it and hitting the stop button just because it just wasn't coming out right. But yeah, all the conversations that I had in as many times as I had it, all of them were helpful, but I never dove in as deep as I really wanted to, and as much as I will today, mainly for the sake of, like I said, I didn't want to burden anybody with the really nitty gritty of the traumas. And even today, I'm going to definitely skip over some of the really graphic stuff that just doesn't need to be repeated out there into the world. But it was very pivotal for me to get it out there and talk about some of this stuff. I think because I did it, I've noticed some other people who've taken similar routes, and the stigmas around mental health that I felt were out there have definitely started to lighten up over the same amount of time from when I went through a lot of this stuff and the stigmas up until now. Basically that you need to open the communication lines when these things happen. If you're struggling with mental illness, and it was something I just needed to realize throughout the course of my journey, no matter how many times people tell you this stuff, I guess it's something you have to experience on your own. But there are people out there who sometimes they feel like they've got nowhere to turn and they don't have anyone to talk to and they don't feel like they have an outlet and they feel like ending it all. And that one was one that I guess motivated me the most, because those are the people who needed the help the most. And, I have to say at all costs for those people, they have to just give it one more day. And after that, they got to give it another day, and they just have to keep on trying, and they just take it one day, one step at a time. And it's one of the most valuable lessons I heard from many people who were at their rock bottom and managed to turn back. But yeah, I've had this episode on the back burner for a while, and I have to say, shying away from it was something I caught myself doing a little bit, procrastinating and letting other things in to keep myself busy. And, I had to realize I had to redirect myself here and focus and settle down on it. And it's just something part of our brains want to protect us from. It's a natural process, and it's amazing because I think that I've got this like seasoned aspect about me after everything I've gone through. But then something like that will happen. It's be like, yeah, well, I guess you don't really still have everything wrapped up in as tight as you thought you had. But this, we'll start with the story. This story goes back to even before I was a police officer at this beautiful place that spans between the towns of Gill and Irving, Massachusetts, over the Connecticut River. It's called the French King Bridge, and it has been for decades, long before I was even born. It was known for its beautiful views. This bridge is massive, and it was known for the great views in the fall time when the leaves change and everything. And, I remember early on when I was actually in elementary school, they had a huge project where they renovated this whole bridge. They redid the whole thing. It took years to redo it. And our elementary school choir was out there, and we actually sung on it. It was pretty cool in the rededication ceremony. But that was one of the only good memories when I thought back to everything, and I'm revisiting this all. That was literally one of the only good memories I had of this place. I never was really there to enjoy the view, because as the years went on, the view just definitely got convoluted for me. It was shortly after high school when I started my law enforcement career at a very young 19 years old. And the pleasant memories just started to get overridden with some very unpleasant experiences from that point forward. And even there was times, even when I was a teenager, which was crazy, that, I had a friend who owned a restaurant right next door to the bridge. It was right there, pretty much next to the bridge. And we spent a lot of time down there, and there would be incidents that happened, and we'd see all the commotion going on. And I remember in like a blizzard one time, a police officer had blocked off the road with the cruiser, as they typically did when there was a person who was out there, because they didn't want traffic driving by. And this is on a major state highway. And I remember going up and just asking what was going on. And they just said, somebody's out there, they're having a rough time. And while sitting there talking to the police officer, we heard the commotion of someone going. We heard the scream and the subsequent splash. And it was just a crazy experience as like a 14 or 15-year-old kid to hear that going on. And that's where it started being a problem. That was in like the early 90s. And then once I became a cop in the late 90s, early 2000s, the first few calls that I had there were, I guess, they were just simple recovery, because when we got there, the person was no longer there. So, they had already gone, and it was something that we had, had to call in special services on and have a boat and a rescue and all that kind of stuff. Because simply this bridge it was way too high for anybody to survive if they ever jumped off of it. And there was always these wives' tales that people did jump and they survived. People would jump off the girders underneath, which were substantially lower. And even those people got really significantly hurt. Just the thrill seekers, just not trying to hurt themselves, but just trying to, jump from high places. And they got hurt really bad. I mean, this bridge was no joke. And every time somebody would have an incident out there, it's in this major highway, and this is a very rural area. So there's not many big roads that connect everybody to everywhere. It would shut down traffic in this major east to west route from Boston, and traffic would be backed up for miles when we had to block the bridge off, and public safety personnel would be out there dealing with these things. They'd have to go out on that dangerous river and try and locate the person. And just these really just amazingly traumatic and complicated scenes. And it became all too regular, really. As the years went on, it kept on happening more and more. And throughout my career, I worked in that town. And one of the first times I actually had to deal with something on my own with an actual person who was out there, I was off duty. And it was crazy because I was starting to get known as like the magnet for these incidents, because it would happen either off duty or on duty, like all the time. And people started to be like, wow, man, you're a magnet for this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I guess so. It's kind of a really unpleasant realization, but it was one where after quite a few, like the first handful, I'm like, why is this happening? Why am I the person who's here? And later on down the road, throughout those years, I realized like that's where I was supposed to be in those moments for one reason or another. And maybe the purpose has now manifested into, what we were able to accomplish recently. But I just couldn't figure it out. My brain just at a certain point was like doing the whole shaking the fist thing at the air. Like, why am I the one who's here, who is always tangled up in these things? But one of the very first ones I had to deal with was when I was off duty, very young, like 19, 20 years old. And a couple was arguing in the middle of the bridge. And one of them was trying to jump, and we had to intervene and grab a hold of the person and literally drag this distraught person in the snow all the way back to the beginning of the bridge, because they were a threat to themselves. And I couldn't remember how many of those times had happened while I was off duty, but there was quite a few times where, not being at work, I was subjected to things that were already weighing down on the psyche because it was sort of part of the job, but I wasn't technically on the job. And it was something that, as the years went on, they picked up in frequency. More people started to find out about the bridge, and, mental health started to become a bit more of an epidemic than it was. And the world turning into, what it had over the last few years, things were starting to pick up. And just, I kept hearing more and more of that term of, wow, you're the magnet for these things. And some of the guys in the cop circles and stuff like that, they're just really insensitive ways of trying to make light and poke fun at those kinds of things. But, after the conversations were over, it's like, yeah, man, wow, why am I that magnet? Like what is actually going on? You like start to wonder, like, is the universe conspiring against me? Like, what is the deal? And the range of the things that would happen were all over the place. There was some times when we would get there and there'd be someone at the railing, like contemplating life. And it was going to be on my shoulders as this young 20-something-year-old guy, to get them back, the 20-something-year-old kid whose life is in the balance of what's going to happen over the next few minutes. And could I change their mind? And if I didn't, was it my fault? And a lot of heavy stuff weighing on you that they don't exactly tell you when they're handing out jobs. You don't get this stuff for sure. At least you didn't back in the day. You didn't get this kind of stuff, and you didn't get this kind of advisory that this was going to be part of what you signed up for when you go through basic training and everything. Now they're a little bit more sensitive toward that kind of stuff, but definitely difficult circumstances when they repeat on you and you're dealing with these things at such a young age and you just thrust right into it. But yeah, there was a few times where, I would try to approach somebody and thinking of my game plan as I'm walking out there, the person standing there thinking I was going to be this hero. And as I start to approach, boom, they just go and they disappear. And it was a crazy thing to see the first few times. It was, your goal was to try and get close enough to develop a dialogue, because they always told you in your training, if you could get there and talk with them, you had the best chance. The people who really wanted to go, they would go. They wouldn't be there waiting for you. And the ones that were there that you were able to talk to, those were the best chance you had of saving anybody. It was a sign that maybe they wanted to be saved, that they were hesitating. And, I remember the first few, I was able to develop a dialogue with people. There were people that we were able to talk off the railing and stuff like that. I'm thinking to myself, like, what could this person be going through in their life that is so awful and painful that they think that this is the way out? Like, this is the answer. That they think ending life is their only avenue right now. I mean, it's not like I've had an easy life at any given point up to that point, but I definitely didn't see some really bad stuff. I didn't have sunshine and rainbows, but I had nowhere near the type of exposure of that kind of stuff. So I guess I didn't fully understand how a person's life could unravel that much, just being a young and naive and inexperienced, young, optimistic kid who just couldn't comprehend it all. And they definitely did prepare us for that kind of thing, like I said. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. As many of you know, mental health is something that I take very seriously. That's why I've chosen to partner the podcast with BetterHelp. Their licensed therapists can help you identify what areas of your life you're having difficulty with and help you ride the ups and downs of life. I've personally used BetterHelp, and I have to say, for somebody who's experienced with the process of seeing therapists, BetterHelp's resources are beyond amazing. You can choose from their network of over 30,000 licensed professionals to find one that you vibe with. Want a male, female, specific ethnicity, certain religious background? BetterHelp lets you narrow it down that specifically so you can find the perfect therapist for your care. And you can easily change therapists at any time, which I have no intention of doing because my therapist, Bruce, is the man. I have amazing conversations with him. I leave our sessions not only feeling like I've taken a weight off my shoulders, but I leave the sessions with objectives to accomplish for the next appointment. You can choose video, audio, or chat sessions that all go right through the app, as well as journal entries that you can send right to your therapist so they know ahead of time what you might want to work on. They offer live webinars on a range of subjects, all of which adds to the toolbox for your mental well-being. Jump on the solution that millions are turning to. Visit betterhelp.com/livethislife to get started and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That's betterhelp.com/livethislife. One of the ones that affected me extremely deeply that I found myself thinking about when I was out there on the bridge for this, the conclusion ceremony and everything, it was early on in my career, and I was able to walk close enough to the railing, and I was able to talk to this woman for a few minutes. And this is one that I had probably one of the toughest times with out of all of them. She was probably in like her 30s, like early to mid 30s. And as I approached her, I was coming up on her left side, and, you know, she was facing the railing. She was still standing on the sidewalk, and you could tell she had been visibly crying for a while. And I don't remember exactly what I said or how I broke into the conversation. It was probably something pretty lame, like, how you doing tonight, or something. Like, obviously not doing really good, but what do you say in those instances? But I was, I do remember that she didn't really acknowledge that I was even there the entire time. Like, didn't look my way, didn't respond to anything that I had said. And, you know, I tried to get a dialogue going with her until more help arrived. And I mean, I was probably like 21 or 22 at the time. And she kept looking over her right shoulder, and she would be holding onto the railing, and she'd kind of lean back and look over her right shoulder away from me, and come back to the way she was standing and just kind of like look out towards the water. And at a few times she did that. And then once the cruiser pulled up to block traffic, it pulled up in that direction. I was probably only about like 10 feet away from her at that point, and I was trying to get closer. I was doing this like leaning on the railing thing, trying to look all disarmed and just look like I was just kind of like relaxing and not ready to pounce. But while the entire time I'm thinking of how can I get close enough to make my move so I have the distance closed enough that I can act quick and try and grab her and pounce. So the cruiser pulled up, and she did that lean thing again and lean back. And then just in that motion that she had already taken quite a few times, when she leaned back forward, she just jumped right over, and it was so fast. I didn't get a chance to move, and I didn't have a chance to act quick enough. It was like by the time it even registered, I was barely moving myself. But there I was talking to her one moment, and the next, everything changed. And all I remember is just what I can only describe as like a scream of regret on the way down and a splash. And being there, left in the vacuum of that experience, thinking to myself, like, what could you have done better? Like, you should have acted quicker. You shouldn't have tried to do your like Mel Gibson bullshit and tried to move in a little bit faster. And I blame myself for that one for the longest time. And in a way, I still kind of do. And revisiting that story, I felt dumb as hell for not taking a different approach in that entire instance. But ultimately, I tried to learn from it. I tried to get some sort of valuable experience out of the entire thing. I started taking all sorts of trainings because it was that whole I need to understand why this is happening again, type of end result of the instance. So I took classes on suicide prevention, which I'd already done. I took even more. I took mental health first aid classes, wrote papers and psychology classes while I was going to college on suicide, because I wanted to know the why. I had to understand it beyond it was me that let the person go, rather than this was a decision they were making and I was only in their way. It wasn't my fault. It was something that was a thought process, and I need to understand, I guess, that thought process. And to an extent, I understand it academically and physiologically and everything, and understand certain theories behind it all. But still, I guess I really just don't understand it because I don't have the mental patterns that happen. When everybody says, like, I can't imagine what you're going through, or I've been through something like that, it's like every person's experience is so subjective. You can never know what somebody's going through. And in those instances, like I said, I haven't been through hard enough times to understand it. And people who have been that low, they get it to a certain extent, but everybody's experience is completely different. But there were many times where I just sat there and thought about those instances and what must have been going on, and how, if I were that person, how could somebody else save me if I were in that circumstance? What could they say and what could they do to get me to walk away from the edge? That was a tough one. But yeah, one of the memories that I had that was actually a good one, if there were any good ones, it was a good one compared to all the others. There was this woman one night that I happened to stop and check on. And with this one, I know that I had impacted her life forever, as well as her impacting mine. Because it wasn't so much that I saved her that night, because sometimes you save somebody, and I've heard of repeat attempts. This woman, I knew I saved for the long haul. And although I never get to cross paths with her again, I got sort of a bookmark on that entire thing when it ended up coming to fruition. It was about like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and she was parked in the rest area at the end of the bridge, where people would park and they'd go out and look at the view. And I knew at that time of night, if there were cars there, it wasn't a good thing. Nothing good came from any car that was parked there late at night. So I walk up to the window, and she was sitting in the driver's seat, and there was a big bottle of vodka in the console, in plain sight, and it was almost empty. And she was crying, and I asked her if she was okay, and she said no. And I asked her, "Are you having a rough time tonight?" And she said, "Yeah." And it was not about the alcohol at that point. I knew exactly why she was there and what was going on. Didn't make it anything about the drinking and driving or anything like that. And I just said, I'm here to help you. And she just broke down. And this one was actually later on in my years. I think I was probably near 30. Had been through a decent amount of stuff at that time. I'd already been through at least one of the cancers. I think probably both of them. And I'd been in this situation quite a few times and had all those trainings and stuff that I'd gone to. It felt like I was kind of like seasoned on this one. And I'd been diving into a lot more of my own internal processes of appreciating life a little bit more. And not only in that process did I appreciate my own life, I just appreciated life in general and everybody's experiences of life and how precious life actually was. And I think that made me a little bit more empathetic toward this one particular person. I remember her telling me after I started talking to her, she said, "I've got nothing. I've got no one." She said she was sick. She was having health problems, and there was just nobody there, and she had enough. And that she was all alone. And I told her in this moment, I'm like, well, you're not all alone in this moment. You have me. And as we sat there and we were waiting for an ambulance, I tried to just keep talking with her and everything, and she just said, "I'm scared." And I told her that, told her what my name was, and I'd been in this situation before, and that I wanted her to know that I was there to help her, and I was there to make sure she was going to be okay and that she wasn't in trouble, and that everybody who was going to show up was going to feel the same exact way. And that this whole circumstance that she's going through, she should feel like it's nothing but a bump in the road, and that it's no different. Like if we fell down and broke our leg, it's something that we are hurting in a certain place, and we need to go get the help that we need to help us through that hurt, that injury. And that the good thing is that someone up above put her and I in a crash course together, and that I was there by her side, and I wasn't going to let anything happen in those instances other than getting her to a safe place at that time. And she told me she had nothing to live for and her family didn't care about her. And I told her that, I had no idea what she was going through personally since, everybody's battle is unique, but I shared some of my story with her very briefly, and that I was more than just some other person in uniform. And I let her know the person behind the badge. And I think that's one of the biggest things that some people can learn. And I know a lot of people in that line of work don't put the greatest face on that profession sometimes, and they make more headlines than anything. So it's great to break that stigma whenever I'd have the chance. I mean, I'm over 5 years removed from the job now, but I just remember trying to humanize people's experience as much as I possibly could, because I didn't see myself in that light. I saw myself as a person, and I need her to see me as that as well, given how scared she was and everything. But I shared some of my story with her, and I remember telling her that despite what I had gone through in some of my darkest days, that I knew that the brightest times were going to follow those dark days. And that if I packed it up in those really dark moments, that I would be cheating myself out of all those other great moments that were going to come. And that those moments of pain in our life were completely unavoidable. It's going to happen. But you have to know that when the tides of the bad times are turning, the good times have to come back in. It's just a law of how things work. And sometimes it can go even further down to a rock bottom, but that just means you have such a greater place to come back to. And I reminded her of some of the things. I told her about some of the stuff that I looked forward to the most when I was like in my healing process, and I couldn't get outside and I couldn't go to the gym and I couldn't do all the things that I loved. The things that I looked forward to in those moments, rather than being sorry for myself about what I couldn't do and what I didn't have and what I'd maybe lost in those moments, that I had so many other things to look forward to once I was good again. That I loved my time at the beach. I loved warm, sunny days. And it was like a cold spring day, and talked about how, the nice summer days are right around the corner, and how I love doing my walks and my runs on the beach and no one else there but me. And I love the sights and the smells and all of it. It's just an experience that I have to myself, and it didn't require anybody else. And that there's things that you have to learn how to do, that you can just do them on your own and be happy. And there has to be some of those kinds of things in your own life that you love about life as well. Like maybe you're not having great times with family, but there's got to be those things that you love to do and you look forward to so much. And those are the things you have to view. You have to look at that perspective. And I remember ending it with, we have a choice to look at our life as the half full or half empty perspective that we always hear. And no matter what I've lost, no matter how empty my cup may have looked, I still had something in my cup. And on top of that, it just meant I had more room to fill my cup up with something else. And that something else was going to be something amazing. And I remember that when we got her into the ambulance, that's pretty much my cue that my part is over. I remember that night in particular, though, I filed the ambulance to the hospital and filed the paperwork there. And I remember sticking around for that one and checked back in on her before I was leaving. And, I could tell she was just very much scared and at a rock bottom. But when I opened the curtain, she saw a familiar face. You could just see it, makes me well up now, but you could just see the relief that it wasn't just another unknown person, medical person, nurse or anything like that. I walked through the curtain. I remember seeing her face that way, and just remember telling her that everything was going to be okay. And that I look forward to seeing her again, not in these circumstances. And that I hope she came to talk to me sometime. So you fast forward a few months. I don't even know how long it was. Time just passed kind of weird in those times, and time just went by. And I didn't give it a ton of thought afterwards. There's maybe a few thoughts of wondering what happens to some of these kinds of people, especially in ones like that where you felt like you made a difference. And in this particular instance, it was one that sticks out of my head so much because she showed up at the police station to talk with me quite a while later. I wasn't working that day, but I only lived like a mile from the station at the time. And a couple other people who were there at the station called me up and said this lady was looking for me and wanted to talk to me about an incident that I had on the bridge, and that she wanted to thank me for saving her life. And I think it was like doing housework or something at the time. I had to get cleaned up, and I told them hey, if she's still out there, go stop her. I'll be right down. So, it took me probably 10 or 15 minutes to just at least get a little bit presentable and not a mess. And by the time I got down there, she was already gone. But they told me that, yeah, she wanted to thank you for for what you did, and that she mentioned something about how you told her about some, memorable and enjoyable things in life and the sunny days at the beach, and that's all she's been focused on is just doing good things for herself since she's gone through her treatment, and that she was just thankful for everything that you did back then. And it was just, although I didn't get to meet her face to face that day, the message that she intended to deliver was one that is just something I'll never forget. I'll tell you, it's one of the things that in that line of work, it was probably one of the proudest moments that I ever had, because I didn't have to wonder if I made an impact. It was like, yes, I not only saved a life that day, but I think it saved it, for the long run as well. And I'll tell you, just like the little things I mentioned to her that day that kept, the little things that keep us all going in our darkest moments and some of our lowest times and everything. It was that one particular incident that kept me going in some of my darkest times when I felt like I needed to escape that role. Because I didn't want to subject myself to any more of this stuff. Because at a certain point, I definitely hit my breaking point. I kept on thinking to myself, like, man, I just don't want to experience any more trauma and drama and suffering. Like, I got to get out of here. And my armor's already damaged now. I've got to go before I go through more stuff. And I remember thinking to myself back to that incident and thinking to myself, well, you're here to make an impact in people's lives like that. And if you're not here, then you might not have that chance to impact somebody like that ever again. So that's how I kind of gave the pain that I was going through more of a purpose, and it kept me going. Just the thought that I might be able to help somebody kept my fire burning in some of those lowest times. And that was just many of the times that I felt like I did a job well done out there. But, there were other times that did a lot of damage. And I've talked about them in very close circles, like I said, but I've never really dove into some of these stories like this in a place that a lot of people are going to be hearing about it. And, these are ones that haunted me the most and flashed in my brain whenever I stepped foot on that bridge again, especially just recently. And I'll warn you, a couple of these ones I'm going to breeze through real quick. These ones, I'm not going to get very graphic, but they definitely are tough ones. And in all fairness, it was, it's hard for the average person to hear. And it's actually hard for me to think back to some of these things. But I definitely think it's a great bookend and to let people know that it's like, yeah, some of these things, we can all come back from them. It doesn't mean that we're damaged for life when we go through this stuff as well. You have the mental health aspect side of the people who are going through it in their journey. But then we have our own journey on the other side as people who are in these kind of jobs, whether you're police, fire, nurses, like so many different jobs have these, military, everything. They just have these sides behind them that come with their own challenges. So yeah, when I said I seemed like it was a magnet for this stuff, there was definitely some of the ones where that was an obvious thing, that there was something more divine happening that kept putting me on the crossroads of this. But I can think to a couple of ones, one of them was a base jumper that I actually had. It wasn't traumatic or anything, but just having somebody with a parachute on jump off the bridge and people don't know what's going on. They call it in as a jumper. Happened to be there as the guy's buddy was scooping him up out of the water in a boat, in a little rowboat, waited for the guys to climb up this huge embankment before I ruined the rest of their day by charging them with trespassing, criminal mischief, and whatever else I could throw at them. But on the heels of that one, there was this one call where I was actually off duty again, and somebody was reported on the bridge, and they had a backpack, and it looked like it was possibly a base jumper. And back in those days, we all had our equipment in the cars, and I always kept my radio on like a Yahoo, like some of the young guys always did. And I was heading home, and I was actually heading right across that bridge. I was only like a mile or two away. And as I pulled up, I saw the guy sitting there, and there were other people on the bridge, like sightseeing, and there was people kind of watching this guy. And as I pulled up in the middle of the bridge, there was a cruiser coming from the opposite direction, and we both kind of came up in opposite directions right up to each other. And I think the cruiser must have been going really fast or something, and the fan kicked on, and the guy heard the fan with both of us kind of pulling up in the middle of the road, and he looked over his shoulder, and as he did, pulled out a rope out of the backpack and put it around his neck. He was apparently tying it to the railing, and he went over in combination with a rope. And it was just one of the things that it left you sitting there just going like, oh my God, what had happened? And on top of that, there's people that were there witnessing this. And that was one of the other aspects of this when we testified in front of the state, was there's so many people, like in the public safety realm, you're kind of expected to put yourself in harm's way. You're going to see some stuff. And, you don't sign up for these jobs thinking you're just going to get away from this scot-free with no problems. But the public, they don't count on that. And a lot of the times when, we weren't able to recover somebody, it would be a fisherman with his kids in a canoe that would end up finding somebody, days or weeks later. And it was one of the things that we had to say, like, this is one of many reasons why we have to take some sort of an action. But yeah, that was one that was definitely one that haunted me quite a bit more. And it was just crazy that it was just yet another one that happened off duty. But it was just something that you never forget. Like, some of these things, just the act of it all happening in and of itself was bad enough, but then you think of the compounding effect of all of them one after another, and that's what leads to those eventual injuries. It's almost like you're running on a sprained ankle and you're throwing more and more weight in the backpack, and like, you can run for the first few miles on just regular body weight, but you start adding more weight on that injury and it's just going to become harder and harder and harder. And that's exactly what happened. And the one that broke the camel's back, the one that eventually led me to go get help, was this one particular one that happened on this night of in 2011. And I remember it pretty vividly. I remember that year because that year was hands down the worst year of my life. It was the first year after the second cancer, and I was going through a whole lot of stuff, whole lot of fallout, a bunch of health problems. I had pneumonia several times, and that particular night I was extremely sick. And it was just a year that was really rough, and this just added to it. But the incident really started a downward spiral for me that led to my dark night of the soul, because it compounded a whole bunch of other things together, and it was just a 1, 2, 3 hit that just dropped me to my knees. And I was still trying to recover from everything, and this one it was like you were down and somebody was just grinding their heel on the back of you, and then they were stomping on you while they're down, and then the bus hit you and it backed up over you and ran over you again. It was like just an unbelievable hit after hit. So yeah, I remember it being towards the end of the night, and we would always drive across this bridge to check it towards the end of the night, because like I said, things would happen late at night in this place. And as I'm driving from our side of the bridge to the far side, I happened to see a cruiser had spotlighted a vehicle on the far side of the bridge that was in the rest area. So as I'm driving down that way to go see what was going on, as I'm getting toward the middle of the bridge, I noticed there's a person standing in the middle of the bridge wearing a hoodie. And I just caught him out of the corner of my eye, and I looked directly over at him. And just as I did, the person, I never ever saw their face, but they were smoking a cigarette. All I saw was just that hood with just darkness and a lit cigarette and the glow of it. And it was just an image that I still can't forget to this day. And as I approached the other side of the bridge, I saw that it was a cruiser spotlighting another vehicle, and there was a state trooper, and he was actually already out of the car, and he was walking on the bridge. And I was thinking to myself, like, what are you doing? Like, you never go out to a scene like that without your car. You always bring your car with you. I'd been through things before. I had dragged somebody kicking and screaming in the snow. So, me and my experience and not knowing this person was fairly new, I'm just thinking that to myself. So I go kind of check out what was going on, do a U-turn and come back out on the bridge. And the trooper was already getting pretty close to the person and was giving me like the hand signal to like stay back. And I was just kind of like thinking to myself, like, yeah, okay, like this is my jam. This is my first rodeo. Like, I know how to do this. I'm here to save the day. And I was probably about like 20, 25 yards away, and was about to park my car in the middle of the bridge, and was slowing to a stop. I had my door open a little bit already and was about to get out. And I just remember ready to put the car into gear and figure out how I'm going to approach this entire thing. And I see that the guy has started to jump up on the railing, and at the same time pulled a gun out on himself and took his life. And I was so in shock as to what happened. I just couldn't even tell. At the moment, when I was trying to recall it, I couldn't tell if it was one shot or two. I don't know if it was like the echoes in the valley or what was going on. But all I just remember was the trooper just running in the other direction. He's yelling shots fired. And I remember being really confused and like thinking, I said it out loud, by who? Like, I couldn't figure it out. So, I called it in that we had a shots fired and one in the water, and the person was gone. They weren't there anymore. So I didn't actually see everything. It happened so quick. It was like, almost like you didn't believe your eyes. So, from that point forward, it was just a complete blur. And I can only attribute it to just being in such a state of shock. Because I had a very vivid memory. I've had mental cognition things done and stuff like that. I get extremely good memory. You guys know I can retain a bunch of stuff, and I'm like a sponge. For some reason that night, I've been told by the people who helped me out with these things afterwards that just like, yeah, the trauma just makes you just kind of block things out, and sometimes your memory just blanks right out on you. And this was one of those nights. And I remember going up to talk to this other officer, and he was having a real rough go about the whole thing. And little did I know that the poor guy had just come home from Iraq and got a job as a police officer and a state trooper, and encountered this. And I actually never saw him again after that. I'm not sure what actually happened, but I know it was a really rough thing for both of us to see. And he was way closer than I was. It was pretty insane to have happen. So I remember after that, going out to the middle of the bridge, and the cavalry just started to arrive. I was a young guy, and everybody in the area, all these people who worked in the towns, we all knew each other. And this was my hometown. It was a place I grew up, and everybody heard the shots fired thing, and everybody came running, and they're like, "Oh my God, I thought you were in trouble." And I was just like, "Yeah, no, this is what happened." But it was good to see people's concern about what had happened. And it was just like, wow, another one, huh? And it's like, yeah, another one. And this one was the cream of the crop as far as all of them goes. This one was definitely a tough one to deal with. And, the boat crews came out, a helicopter kind of came over the mountain and crested over and spotlighted us right in the middle of the bridge. It was like something out of a movie, and it was just surreal. So I just remember, at that point, everything just really just being a blur. I remember getting a hold of my commanding officers and stuff like that, and telling what's going on. It was almost just kind of like, yeah, well, okay, rub some dirt in it, get over it, go write the report, and take it easy the rest of the night. It was something else, because back in those days, there was no how you doing? Are you okay? Is everything all right with you? The night went on, and we never found him. And I remember going home that night, and usually I'd leave all my stuff behind at the station. I wouldn't wear all my stuff home. And that night I went right home. I had all my gear still on. And usually when I got home, I'd come through the door. My little pup that just passed away last year at 18 years old, he'd be waiting for me at the door, and we'd have this little ritual. I'd wrestle with him, and we'd run around the house, and I'd end up at the fridge and get him a snack. It was just like he knew the routine. I walked in the door, and I just went and sat down, and you could tell something snapped in him too, because he was just like, something's wrong with Dad, and just sat there and just laid half on my lap, just kind of like waiting for me to snap out of it. And it was that moment that was a big impactful one for me, because it was like there was nobody else there, and it was a time in my life where there was very little people still left in my life, because of everything I was going through. I was going through some really heavy stuff with the cancer, and I was starting to get bitter at the world. And this obviously didn't help much. And, it was some of the lowest times that the little guy was there, and my other little guy, my son, if it weren't for him, I'm not sure where I would have been in this life. Because the mortality really set in after this one. It was one where I was like, wow, this guy could have taken us out on the way out. What if he wanted to take out the piggies before he went? And I was never even expecting that. Like, we're there to help, and never would have expected that somebody was going to be there to do something that could have hurt us as well. It was just one of the things that sort of cascaded into a whole mindset of like, wow, life is extremely fragile and precious, and you're not indestructible. For the first time ever, I finally came to that realization. I remember people talking about it in the weeks after that, in just circles, not realizing that I was one of the people that was there. And they would have these little side conversations, the coffee hour that we would go to and stuff like that. And, poor, some guy shot himself in front of some poor cops. And I'd be like, yeah, I was one of them. And they were like, oh, wow, boy, this stuff happens to you all the time, doesn't it? But still, never, how you doing? Like, you doing okay? Is everything all right? There was just none of that. And I think one of the biggest indications that I needed to do something about it rather than wait for somebody else to do something for me was I went to work one night, and I went to go walk out of the side door, and with my coffee in hand and my big cruiser bag in the other hand, and we'd open this door up, and the car would be parked there, and the automatic light would come on as soon as you open up the door, and just kind of kicked the door open, and the light didn't come back on, and I stepped right back in and let the door shut, stepped back inside, and it was because I was afraid of the dark. And that was like, I was kind of a nutty kid. Like I was kind of a hellraiser, and going into this job, I was kind of fearless at a certain point. Like I'd be one of those people that we'd have break-ins happening in these old mills where people would steal metal, and waiting for my backup, I would just go in, like sometimes a little stupid, like in the disregard for my safety. And at this point, I was too afraid to take a step outside 5 feet from our police station at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. It was pretty crazy. And I remember having to drop all my stuff. I had to pull out the flashlight. I couldn't go outside without a flashlight. I couldn't just walk around in the dark. And it was something that never happened to me before. And that was my first indication that like something was wrong. It's like, what the fuck is going on with me? This is not who I am. And as time went on, I found myself not even able to drive across that bridge. I would do a U-turn before I got there, say I checked the place, and drive away. And I knew something wasn't right. But it was a really hard time afterwards because, as I said, I started to get more bitter towards the world because I felt like no one cared. Like nobody was even asking about what I was going through, and what was this existence even all about? What's the purpose of continuing to go on when I'm getting beat down with cancer? And it's like, you're going at this alone. And for the first time in my life, like I never considered ever in a million years ending my life, but I'm like, okay, I can see what kind of downward spiral that would lead somebody to some of their darkest moments, where maybe they would end up in some of these places. Like for the first time, I kind of understood, like, wow, I guess this is how someone gets there. This is part of that road. But also, although I never considered ending my life or anything like that, I know that somebody who maybe wasn't as strong as me, who hadn't been through as much, and who didn't have as much to live for, maybe could end up that way. And, I guess it made me a little bit more empathetic toward it all. And it made me really evaluate everything that was going on in my entire life. And I think in life, we all have a couple of those moments and a couple of those things that show us rock bottom. And then we also, on the flip side, have a couple of those things that keep us from hitting that rock bottom, whether it's divine timing and the right intervention of a person being in the right place at the right time, that I was fortunate enough to be in some of those people's darkest moments. And sometimes it's just us. Sometimes it's our connection to God or source, or our kids, or just what we want to do in our life, whatever it is that keeps that fire burning. We always have to remember what it is that we're here for, and what excites us the most in some of the darkest moments, and just use that to get us through to the next day. And one of the best things that I've ever come across was basically just knowing that things were going to get better, that no matter how bad I got it, I always found another reason to keep on going. And that the tide had to come back in. And I knew that if I just waited long enough, it would come back in. And it took months of therapy. Honestly, it did. It took months of therapy to get myself there. And it was a scary circumstance to even go for therapy, because I didn't want to lose my job. I had to do it sort of in secret, because I thought that people would think I lost my mind. I think they would look at me differently. It took me a lot. It took a lot of support for me to even to go back out on that bridge again. I had to have people come with me for the first time, and get over some of the stuff that I had been through. And, I just remember being a complete mess at a certain point, and it took a lot of work. It took definitely a lot of work to get there. I'm not going to make it sound like it was some sort of an easy process to get over, because obviously here it is in 2023, talking 12 years later, and just going back out there. Luckily, having the barriers there in place made me feel like, okay, I'm here. No one else is going to go right now in front of me, because it's literally the only time I ever went on that bridge was when we were dealing with something. So I had that bit of a sense of relief, and I had to keep thinking to myself, like, it's not going to happen. These things are here. They're nearly impossible to get over. You'd have to be a gymnast that was, extremely experienced gymnast to even attempt to get over these things. But yeah, it took years to get over, and it's not an easy process. But eventually, once it does happen, you're realizing how strong you are on the backside of it all. But the story does have a final triumphant ending to it. And I'm not going to say happy ending, because the road that led us there was paved with a lot of loss and a lot of sorrow. But I had a lot of close friends who went through a lot of stuff on this job, and I'm not even sure how many of them went through it because, again, a lot of us didn't talk to each other about stuff. There were guys that were magnets for this stuff as well. They'd have stuff that happened with them all the time. The chiefs that were in the area that worked on day shift, they had a lot of stuff that they'd experience. One of my best friends, Jim Lloyd, who I know listens to the show and is on an amazing path of doing stuff himself, went through a lot of stuff on the job, some pretty serious things. And some of them were some pretty serious incidents on that bridge as well. And, he's recently retired. It's pretty crazy because he's also the selectman in the town next door in the town of Irving. So we both kind of like went through some similar stuff, left the job in the last few years, and then we're doing similar stuff, right near each other. It's kind of amazing the similar paths that we went on. But yeah, the real catalyst that got us over that mountaintop was all of these people coming together and us being led by this one phenomenal woman who was tied to this bridge by an amazing and tragic loss. In 2018, a young man by the name of Brian Hamill drove over an hour to the bridge and he took his life there. Brian was a U.S. naval officer, and his mother, Stacy Hamill, spent weeks after his disappearance searching for him, and he ultimately was never found. And Stacy used that immense loss to fuel her fire to get a project off the ground to install these safety barriers to prevent people from jumping off this bridge after she learned about the history that was going on there. So many of us were, I guess, numb to this because it had been going on and getting worse. It was a slow boil for decades. And someone from outside the area had to come in and look at this whole thing and go, what the hell is going on here? This is ridiculous. Someone needs to do something. Let's go. And she rallied all of us via a big effort, a Facebook support group and everything, titled the French King Bridge Suicide Prevention Barriers. We all joined that group. It's actually still active, but we organized a bunch of standouts on the bridge with signs trying to rally community support on these things. And I remember I met her there for the first time, and it being kind of a strange circumstance, a person like her who had lost so much and was connected to that bridge in that aspect with someone like me who had been through so much tragedy and loss there themselves. And it was definitely an interesting circumstance to be there because there would be some times where we had to notify families of what had happened. And here it was, the fallout from one of those times. And we were there in a common goal to prevent this from happening again. And, this is what happens after the dust settles and you try to push forward and find purpose for everything that you've been through. And her purpose led to something absolutely spectacular. But yeah, I remember at that point I was about 1 or 2 years removed from that job, and that bridge was a place I would avoid at all costs. And I couldn't stand the look of it, never mind being there. There were places on the railing that was still only waist high where people's names and their pictures and bouquets of flowers were tied. And it was really rough going out there for the first few times. But I remember then I got over it because I'm like, I've got to do this. I have to be here. I have to help advocate for what this cause is all about. And it's bigger than what I might be feeling inside right now. And if we can accomplish this, no one else will ever feel this way ever again. So there we were, holding signs on the weekends, people honking horns, me putting myself back in this place, anything we had to do to get it done. But Stacy, she was a tenacious one, and she brought an effort to this whole entire thing that put it right over the top. And we were out there every few weeks or, once a month during some of the winter months. But we were out there and people were really starting to rally behind it with a certain demographic of people saying some really shitty things like, oh, what are we going to do? Bubble wrap the world? Or, they're just going to go do it somewhere else, somehow, some other way. You're going to ruin the view. And it's like, yeah, that one fired me up the most. It's like, you want to talk about a view being ruined? How about all of us? How about all of us who've been affected by it? How bad do you think our view is ruined? How bad do you think the view is ruined by the people who were there when some of these things happened as well, that were just there to take a few pictures with their kids? That view was ruined for so many of us for so long, and people would say some pretty amazingly insensitive things like that. And it blew my mind, but we powered past them. And during COVID, we went to a telehearing and testified in front of the state legislature about our stories and the need for these barriers. And ultimately, the state funded the project, and it was amazing. And it took a couple of years and a few Massachusetts type delays, but the barriers are now there. And in an amazing turn of events, they had the closing ceremony right in mid-October in the middle of Mental Health Awareness Month. And it was just it was an amazing bookend and such a process and a sense of accomplishment that gave me a bit of solace to, and lended some purpose to all the crap that we all went through there and all the people. And, the biggest takeaway that I had, it showed me how strong I was to make it through some of those things and how strong other people were to do the same thing. For Stacy to be as strong as she was, given everything she lost, and realize that, she was in that place where her son disappeared, and that she was so motivated to make sure that no other mother was ever going to feel that way. And it was just such an inspiring turn of events to see all these people who had nothing in common, would never have met each other if they weren't tied to this major tragedy. And, this podcast, everything that I've been through, everything that stemmed from these events, granted, it came from an unpleasant place, but my life would never have ended up the way that it is. It would not be the same. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for all that trauma and everything. And now everything that we were able to accomplish and end that era and put a really big exclamation point and bookend on the entire scenario is just a testament to how someone can be very capable in overcoming some of the greatest obstacles in life and find purpose in some of their darkest moments. It's an amazing thing to witness. And there was this awesome moment in one of those standouts where my wife was out there with me in one of those times, and she caught me looking over the railing, and there was this, the railing again is only waist high, and I was the only one standing out there. And this boat was going by under the bridge, keep in mind it's about 120, 130 feet down. And it's a pontoon boat, party boat, a bunch of people on it. And they were waving up at us. And one person on the boat flashed us a peace sign, and she got a shot of me for the first time in a long time smiling on that bridge. And I remember seeing that picture, and I'm like, you know what? You can do this. Like, you can smile in these places, and it's okay, because we're going to win this fight. And we did. And it's an amazing feeling. So with that, I'm effectively going to turn the page on this one. I'm going to put a bookend on this whole entire thing in this chapter and put the experience behind me. We've had articles written. It was in the Boston Globe, and they did a special article and everything. And it's been quite a ride. And it's transmuted a lot of the negative energy behind the entire experience into something that was absolutely amazing. And for everybody who advocated for this entire thing, we ended up with amazing accomplishment on the backside and a future that we can now move on with and find out what our next level of purpose is in for all of us. I know for me, talking about mental health and the value in getting help whenever it's needed has been something I've been passionate about ever since all of this has bubbled up for me. And I went through all of my post-traumatic stress injuries, PTSI, and learned more about that versus PTSD. And that when you treat these injuries as what they are and you get medical attention for those injuries, you can heal a lot faster than you would than if you did it on your own. It's like a sprained ankle, like I said before, and if you don't take care of it, it can just compound and get worse. And I'd like to think that a lot of people, a lot of places have moved on, and they've treated mental health a lot differently than they did in the past. And it's been a great motivator to see that continue to change and see these aspects of appreciating and treating mental health as something that is normal and something that we all need to address. It's great to see it getting more and more normalized as time goes on. But there are people out there who have been through rough times, and you might be one of them. And no matter what line of work that you're in, it happens in so many different lines of work. No matter what it is, no matter what experience you've had, whether you're a veteran, a nurse, or anything, there's all different levels of work. I know teachers are going through hell in some certain spots, and they see a lot of rough stuff. You're worth the help. You're worth it. You're worth the work that you need to put into it to get better. If you're having a rough go with life and you've ever had the thoughts that it's just not worth it, you have to know that getting help in those moments is just as important, if not more important. There are people who value you. There are people who want to see you thriving, and there's people whose job it is to make sure that you continue on to tomorrow. They don't want to see you in those dark places. And when you're in those dark places and having those rough times, you can find yourself in a place where some of the brightest lights are going to shine at the same time. And there are people who do care. There are many people who want you to be here tomorrow. Keep living. you or anyone you know is having a crisis moment, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is the place to turn. It's free and confidential for those who are in distress, for either you or someone you care about.